Pedophiles. Hello, the purpose of today's video is to take a look over the current psychological perspective on pedophilia themed obsessive-compulsive disorder. I am by no means an expert on OCD, but I do like to talk about things I find interesting. Let's start off with a definition. Pedophilic OCD is a manifestation of obsessive-compulsive disorder characterized by persistent obsession with the fear of unwanted sexual thoughts of children. This concept is distinct and entirely separate from a pedophilic attraction to children in that the individual does not have an attraction to children, but rather obsessively fears that they have an attraction to children to the point of significant distress. And unlike pedophilia, individuals suffering from pedophilic OCD feel disgust, distress, and anxiety towards sexual thoughts involving children, and fear that they might become a pedophile in time. As such, the condition is a form of obsessive-compulsive disorder as opposed to a form of pedophilia. Though this condition is fairly neglected overall, thanks to the work of many researchers and psychologists, we can better understand this debilitating affliction. Pedophilic OCD can typically affect one's quality of life significantly, and the result of this is diminished functioning in both academic, home life, and social interactions, not to mention the problems it can bring up with one's career. I mean, can you imagine trying to go to work when every time you go outside you have to wonder if you're going to molest a kid? It could be very stressful. Now, obsessive thoughts can vary from person to person, but generally they involve an incessant worrying about the individual's previous interactions with children, often misinterpreting and irrationally scrutinizing their own past behavior. These constant reviews of past behavior can be very stressful, especially since it brings about the concern that the individual might be a danger to people around them. Behavior is also used to reinforce distress, especially when an individual engages in somatic checking, which is checking one's body for sensations in response to a trigger. For example, a person in pedophilic OCD might be changing the kid's diaper, and because they change the kid's diaper, the thought pops up into their head that, oh, am I molesting my kid without my own knowledge? And then they check their genitals to confirm whether they're feeling any kind of sexual arousal to the situation, and in the process of doing this somatic check-in, they might end up arousing themselves and then misattributing their arousal to the presence of a child, which then causes the negative feedback loop that is one of the central problems that we're discussing right now. This type of behavior is typically common among people suffering with OCD in general. That's the repetitive checking of sensations in response to triggers. But in pedophilic OCD, this typically results in an individual checking their body for sexual arousal to children. Unfortunately, this obsessive checking can cause sexual arousal on its own, leading to the person becoming more anxious around children. Reassurance seeking is also a commonly seen behavior, whereas the individual will try to seek reassurance regarding their thoughts. This can often prompt a person to seek out assurance online by asking others close to them for insights. Inevitably though, if you keep asking people whether they think you're a pedophile or not, eventually someone's gonna say that's a weird question to ask, and then re-establishes or reinforces this feedback loop. Another prominent consequence of pedophilic OCD is avoidance. In an attempt to avoid triggering stimuli like children, child-related objects, situations where they could contact children, one can end up being a problem or causing problems in their own life. If you were to avoid children in every single way possible, this could cause a person to stop going outside, to stop going to the mall, to stop going to school, to stop going to a hospital, just to avoid running into a child somehow because you're afraid you might do something to them. The individual will often distance themselves from triggers, which only worsens this condition over time. For parents, this compulsion is even more of a problem because it causes them to neglect their parental duties out of fear of harm. They think they will be a harm to their own children. One should keep in mind that compulsions are also carried out to avoid obsessions like constant assurance seeking to neutralize their fear and anxiety of being a pedophile. Now, when it comes to assessment, even though pedophilic OCD does not have a specialized assessment tool as far as I'm aware, it is generally advised to use the other OCD scales in combination with proper education on the part of the clinician. The Yale-Brown Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder Scale, as well as the 20-item dimensional Obsessive-Compulsive Scale, paired with the Sexually Intrusive Thoughts subscale, can serve as good tools for a skilled clinician to use. Good tools for skilled clinician to use. A trained clinician would employ a semi-structured interview to get a better grasp of the individual's presentation. You can check the resources put in the description for more specialized information for those who need it or for those who are interested. But the question is now, how actually is pedophilic OCD different from pedophilia? Well, the differences are very important. When a pedophile is anxious or fearful of their attraction to children, it is often the result of their fears about the consequences of their attraction, such as the fear of social ramifications or legal responses. But an individual with pedophilic OCD is not attracted to children, nor are they sexually aroused by children. They are afraid that they might be, and find their unwanted intrusive sexual thoughts about children distressing. A pedophile might prefer the company of children, but a person with pedophilic OCD might avoid interacting with children to an irrational degree. To fully understand whether an individual may be attracted to children or worried that they might be caught, or whether they are afraid that their intrusive thoughts is a sign of being a pedophile, ask them to elaborate on their concerns, because typically talking to someone is a good way to get a gauge on the way they think. It is also important to keep in mind that pedophilic OCD is distinct from ego-dystonic pedophilia. Which is when a pedophile feels that their attraction is in conflict with their moral system. In other words, a pedophile who finds their attraction morally unacceptable. An ego-dystonic pedophile is still sexually attracted to children, they just don't want to act on their attraction for moral reasons. These types of pedophiles are usually called virtuous pedophiles or no-contact pedophiles, which is different from pedophilic OCD. Confusing the two isn't totally unexpected, especially for the average layman with no experience on this topic. A lot of people, including clinicians, are usually focused on the pedophilic thoughts aspect of this condition, to the point that they don't even take into account that this is an obsessive-compulsive disorder. Now, as far as treatment goes, pedophilic OCD can be tackled in a couple ways. Exposure and response therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and psychoeducation can go a very long way. Likely due to the taboo nature of this obsession, pedophilic OCD is more treatment resistant than other forms of OCD, which is why an open mind and a judgment-free environment is important. I'm sure if you've made it this far into the video, this may already be clear to you, but intrusive thoughts aren't something we can control, and they are not a sign that something is wrong with us. Compulsions like avoidance of triggers and misinterpreting past events only make the condition worse by impairing the individual's ability to handle otherwise normal interactions. It may seem hard or even uncomfortable, but exposure is effective. It is important to not mix up these concepts, as treatment options can lead to a drastically different effect. If you treat somebody with pedophilia as if they have pedophilic OCD, that can obviously lead to problems, and vice versa. It is dangerous and unhelpful to use exposure therapy as you would for somebody with pedophilic OCD on pedophilia. It would only make their thoughts worse, and having an individual with pedophilic OCD suppress their urges, and like you would with a pedophile, will only promote avoidant behavior and worsen their anxiety, making compulsive behaviors more likely. A person suffering with this condition can go through many phases and end up in a cycle of using obsessive patterns to reinforce compulsive behavior. This condition is often so distressing that an individual might try to kill themselves or engage in self-harm. Intrusive thoughts can be gross, violent, or downright repugnant, but it is normal. These unwanted thoughts can pop up, and everyone at some point has had a thought that they would never act on. You are not a pedophile simply because of your thoughts, especially if you do not want to act on them. Now, let's look into a hypothetical. Mr. O is a man in his late 20s. He recently had a kid with his wife of 5 years. Although Mr. O had never previously even considered having sexual thoughts about children, he recently began to think back to yesterday when he had an image of him sexually molesting his child flashed into his mind. Mr. O was disgusted and distressed by this and began to research online information about pedophiles and parental child molesters. When he was changing his child's diaper later that day, he had another obtrusive thought, similar to that of yesterday. In response, Mr. O began checking his genitals for any sign of arousal. What type of creep even thinks about this while changing the diaper? Am I a pedophile? Mr. O asked himself, using this event as confirmation of his fears. As a result, Mr. O stopped changing his child's diapers alone, and then eventually stopped being alone in the same room with his child. Later on, Mr. O began to question if he had molested his child without realizing it. What if he had molested them and then forgot about it? What if he was a pedophile. He would get arrested and he would risk losing his whole family and his career and pretty much his life. Mr. O began to avoid all children. He stopped going to parks and he could no longer be out in public because he was afraid of walking past a child. His obsessions began to weigh on his mind and ruin his relationship with his family. And he continued to seek reassurance from his wife, who eventually began to feel estranged from him. Mr. O considered overdosing on his medication in his bedroom, but was rushed to the emergency room on the behest of his wife.